Welcome to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. I'm Peter Lewis, the Director of the Centre. This week we're sharing a panel discussion held at NetThing 2022, centred around my colleague Jordan Gow's terrific new book, Disconnect: Why We Get Pushed to Extremes Online and How to Stop It. Joining us in the discussion are Centre for Digital Wellbeing founder Carla Wilshire and Guardian Australia Managing Director Dan Stinton. Before we dive into some of the stories that anchor your analysis, Jordan, maybe just, do you want to share the why and the how of Disconnect, and critically what sort of conversation you're looking to spark?
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. So Disconnect really came about because I started to see an escalation of the online harms caused by the current setup of the internet over the last few years. And I think we all have to some degree. But it started to really affect me when I started to recognize people that I knew. So not, crazies from far away, but people who were like 1 degree removed from me start to exhibit some of these issues. So for example, falling for, online conspiracies, starting to attend lockdown protests and being anti-vaxxers, starting to be victimized by trolls and screen addicts. So it felt like there was a very real escalation in the last 3 to 5 years of that happening. And so I started very tentatively talking to different groups of people about the idea for the book. And even though it wasn't a statistically significant sample of, thousands, everyone I spoke to said, yes, I know somebody who's like that. And so for me, it felt like there was a real reason to start to explore this issue very closely. And that's where the genesis of the book really came. Through that process, I was able to interview, lots of different people, dozens and dozens. And it really felt like this is a real mental health crisis that we're stumbling into and that we're not really prepared to address.
That's great, mate. So look, let's look at some of the personas. You give us the freedom fighter, the social media narcissist, the hateful troll, the dating app pest, but also a couple that we thought we'd go into a little bit more detail. And let's start with the online conspiracy theorist. And as somebody who has battled his share of online conspiracies, Dan, I thought you could lead this part of the discussion.
Thank you, Peter. And yeah, Jordan, congratulations on the book, mate. I was reading it furiously last night, and I got to say it's a really compelling read. And I think the anecdotal nature of it is actually what makes it compelling, because as you said at the start, we all know people that probably fit the personas in this book. And I think your strategies on how to engage with them are something we should explore here. But yeah, as Peter mentioned, your book opened with the online conspiracy theorist chapter after a bit of introduction and a bit of history on the QAnon sort of curiosity, if you like, or conspiracy theory. Now, look, I suspect everyone here knows about this, but just in case, this is a very strange conspiracy theory. It started about 2016, and it effectively alleges that the world is run by a group of progressive elites, including the Clintons and the Obamas, and they run the world for the purposes of running an international pedophile ring, amongst other things. And it also alleges that Donald Trump is the savior who essentially rose to power in order to expose this ring and bust it wide open. There's many different variations of this, but that's sort of the kernel of it, if you like. Now, it's clearly crazy, and crazy ideas have been around for a long time. But what was interesting about this is that it started on a fringe website, 4chan, a site with zero moderation and has some pretty vile content, but it then migrated onto Reddit, and then before you know it was sort of going everywhere on Facebook, and before they sort of realized it. You also then touch on, Jordan, just to go into another conspiracy theory, you go on to another one which kicked off around the start of the pandemic, and that outlines effectively that COVID vaccines are either ineffective or worse, that there's something that Bill Gates invented in order to insert microchips into the world's populations. Now, what I find interesting about both of these phenomena is that the crazy ideas have been around for as long as humans could tell stories, right? But they have tended to exist on the fringes and never gained mainstream adoption. And, I guess as someone who has worked in mainstream media for a couple of decades, I can speak from experience that we often receive tip-offs of different conspiracies in the newsrooms. Most turn out to be nothing, the vast majority do, but and have no evidence to support them, but a small number actually do turn out to be true, and they become something that the mainstream news media covers. What has changed recently, though, obviously, is that the gatekeepers of information, the mainstream news sites, that's basically been busted wide open. And now everyone can be a publisher and put whatever crazy theory you want on social media. And because companies like Facebook reward engagement at all costs, these fringe and crazy ideas are very interesting to people and therefore drive engagement. And so regardless of whether they are true, they get boosted in the newsfeed and they receive widespread adoption. And this becomes something which is huge. And, millions of people in different parts of the globe can start to follow them. So my first question for you, Jordan, is, and I guess it's an obvious one, but nonetheless an important one. Just touch on how important you think social media has been for the growth of conspiracy theories, because they have existed forever, right? Why has social media become the fuel that's amplified a lot of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to all the different case studies that I spoke to, it was very clear to almost all of them that there were two sites in particular that was actually really set the, one quote was, put petrol in the fire of their conspiracy theory laden loved ones. And I do call those platforms out, and it's Facebook and YouTube primarily. And I think what was interesting going through the research was, as you mentioned, it all started, QAnon in particular started in 4chan. And, I think most people probably wouldn't have experienced 4chan because it's quite particular. It's got its own sort of vocabulary and etiquette. But then there was a jumping off point when some of those conspiracy theories that were circulating in 4chan started getting posted in Reddit, which is slightly more accessible as a platform. So Reddit, for anybody who's not familiar, is they call themselves the front page of the internet, and it's essentially a big collection of forums. And so, it went from a hyper niche, hyper fringe sort of environment to a slightly more mainstream environment. So that was one jumping off point. But then the real sort of escalation and what was really noticeable in terms of the speed, the scale, and the spread of these conspiracies was when it jumped from Reddit to the mainstream platforms like Facebook and YouTube. And, whether you're a fan of Reddit or not, the platform still had some sort of moderation controls attached to it. So there's things like downvotes. So if you don't like a particular thing, like a conspiracy theory, you can downvote it until it disappears. There's things like karma scores, where your profile has a score to sort of tell you whether you're reliable or not. So there was still a degree of control over that environment within Reddit. But as we know, in Facebook and YouTube, there's absolutely no moderation whatsoever. And that's when the problems really started to hit. And on top of that, we know that algorithmically, Facebook and YouTube's algorithms, if it thinks it likes that you like one particular thing, it'll serve you that thing buffet style until you're full of it, right? So I think that jump from those niche online environments into these really global, billions of users and audiences, platforms like Facebook and YouTube, that was the real sort of escalation moment.
Conscious of time, just one quick one. So Jordan, one of the things that's great about your book is that you go into both things that the individual can do to combat these kind of phenomena, as well as things that regulators can do in the platforms themselves. I just wouldn't mind starting with this one in particular on individuals, if we could, and just ask you one last question. So look, I know lots of people, I suspect we all do, as you said at the start, of that have fallen down the anti-vaxxer rabbit hole in particular, off the back of the pandemic. And I have just simply been unable to turn around people's minds on this. It doesn't seem that no matter what evidence you throw at them, it doesn't help. Now, I also think get accused of being part of the problem because I run a mainstream media organisation in the country, so I'm probably coming to it from a pretty distrusted position for a lot of these people. But my question is, what can individuals do, not the ones that are necessarily believing these conspiracy theories, but people who are friends and family of them, to try and bring them back to reality? What would you recommend?
I'm going to cheat a little bit and kind of preface that I think when it comes to some of these media topics, the bulk of the responsibility should definitely be on institutions. So the tech platforms should definitely invest in moderation. Government should invest in more research to understand this phenomenon and invest in rehabilitation techniques. But the reason why the recommendations were split into two, so what we can do societal level, but also at an individual level, is to make people feel like there's some sort of agency or control over that situation. And so to answer your question directly, there's a few specific techniques that people can try. And so one of it is actually debunking. And so that's quite a controversial one because, as you said, for people who are really down in this rabbit hole, no amount of logic or reason can get through to them. But there's slightly different techniques that you could do or that you could try as part of that. And a lot of the recommendations came from a book that was written by a guy called Mick West, and he calls himself a professional debunker. So the first and most obvious layer is obviously refuting that particular claim, and only that would only work if it's simple enough to refute. So it's like a very specific situation or fact. But the other two techniques that he proposes is called spotlighting and floodlighting, and they're both about essentially providing so much evidence and so much factual information that person is kind of left with no real alternatives or rebuttals. And the reason why that might work for some people, and not at all saying that it might work for everybody, is that often people who are down these rabbit holes get really quite obsessive. And part of the value that they think they have is the specificity of their theories. And so if you really want to engage and you're able to refute it at the level that they think they have expertise on, according to guys like Mick West, so that might be one way of getting through to them. But ultimately, it's about engaging in good faith and having open communications with them. And, the first recommendation in the book is actually asking, are you up for that? And, do you want to take the time and sustain effort to engage with that person? And in most cases, it's probably not going to happen. And so a lot of the case studies in the book, the people who are up for it are the ones closest to them. So partners, husbands, wives, because it takes that much effort, to even have any kind of traction.
Carla, your organisation, the Centre for Digital Wellbeing, has a particular interest in the wellbeing of children. I would have thought that the Screen Addict chapter would have been compelling reading for you. What do you take away from that part of the book?
Can I just say, first of all, absolutely fantastic book. I haven't finished it entirely, but I started flying through it and it's just beautifully written. The chapter that I particularly found fascinating, obviously, was the chapter around addiction, but just even some really eloquent phrases and lines. We're gaming even when we don't realize it. We are now effectively so immersed into gaming and so immersed into technology that, to some extent, a lot of the ways in which we're interacting with technology have changed us to such a fundamental level that we don't even necessarily have that awareness. And another quote I pulled out from the book was, today's internet is basically one big game. And I think, Jordan, you so articulately captured, and particularly by introducing us to the persona of Patrick, a 23-year-old who got completely hooked and immersed into Call of Duty. And you introduced us to his struggles, which on the one hand, he felt that it was such a fulfilling part of his life. And yet at the other hand, there was this deep sense of sadness that in some senses his immersiveness into the gaming world had cost him so much in terms of his real world life. And it was really only after years that the realization came that, he'd missed time with his mother, and it was only after she passed. And so, to some extent, I found the reading of the book very profound and very evocative. I think, Patrick, you point out that to some extent, in terms of behavioural addictions, we've now moved to the point where gaming has become part of the DSM, the clinical management around psychology, and to some extent has been now recognised as something that is in need of treatment. And you took us through some of those studies, the study in terms of the Finnish study around the way in which interaction engagement, so multiplayer games, really is so addictive, because just knowing that you're playing against someone else really does amplify that addiction. But also the way in which screen time and gaming really does interrupt the development of your frontal cortex, and how that that ultimately does affect the structures of a brain. And for a generation that's coming, that is spending so much time on screens and so much time in gaming, that the realization that their brain structures are starting to change during their developmental phase will probably be reset for life, to me is probably one of the most terrifying parts of studying this area. So, congratulations again, but I really wanted to deep dive in and ask you if you can tell us, Jordan, just a little bit more about what are the mechanisms that create addiction in terms of gaming.
Yeah, the gaming chapter is really interesting. So it's sort of about screen addiction essentially, and gaming is interesting because it's the first internet or screen related disorder that's been officially recognized by the World Health Organization and by the DSM, as you mentioned, which is the official clinical standard for disorders. Having said that, on the entry, if you look at the DSM list, it's called internet gaming disorder, and the only sort of thing attached to it is needs further study. And so, going through this chapter, what it really highlighted was how we're quite dismissive of screen or virtual disorders. And I'll answer your question in a moment, but I just really wanted to share this anecdote where one of the psychologists I interviewed in that chapter, he treats gaming disorders for a living. He's one of the few in Australia available to do that. And he attended a conference on addiction. And, the kind of addiction that conference was talking about was, hard drugs like heroin or gambling addiction. So pretty full on. And when he introduced himself and told people what he did, he was kind of laughed at. And so I think we still don't recognize virtual disorders and virtual addictions as legitimate, even though, as you mentioned, the way the internet is currently set up now is one large game. And a lot of websites and apps use gamification techniques basically as a core part of their platform environment now. So there was a time when gamification was kind of cool and people started to integrate those techniques, but now they're all over the place. So things like intermittent rewards, profile scores, even things like leaderboards, running scores and things like that. So like the features of gamification sort of permeates across basically most of the major websites and internet infrastructure that we see.
Can I ask a follow-up? I mean, to some extent, it has been an evolution to get to the point where we've gotten to around the tools of addiction in terms of gaming and the internet. As we move into Web3 and the metaverse, do you see those tools around addiction as getting worse, stabilizing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's, I think, a chapter we're going to go on to speak about, which is about the futurists. So I think what's interesting about those new phases of the web that we're being told about, like the metaverse, is that they're not realized yet, and they're essentially end goals that some of the biggest tech companies are working towards. But the thing I'll say about that is we clearly haven't addressed or resolved some of the current issues we have with this phase of the web. And so, I don't have a lot of confidence that we can build those new phases in a way that's safe and equitable when we're still going through those issues now. And so in a lot of ways that it might actually get worse in this new environment where, we are sort of barely understanding what it looks like, and we're only starting to come to terms with what that setup looks like.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into your final persona, which is the naive futurist. And obviously, there are a lot of big targets of very successful naive futurists and also a lot of less successful ones floating around. Where do you see the fault lines and the key decision points that are going to be made in the way that the Web3, if that's what it becomes, or blockchain develop? Like, what are the critical inflection points?
Yeah, Web3 is really quite challenging. Again, because it's an end state that people are working towards that, isn't quite here yet. But it seems like the philosophy behind it is basically an idea that we want to abolish the current governance of the internet. And so, it's underpinned by blockchain technology, which is essentially a distributed ledger. And one of the case studies for the Futures chapter is this great woman called Michaela, and she is a veteran technologist. I think I agree with her position a lot. And in her mind, there's a disconnect between the vision for Web3 as this decentralized, free from governance kind of world, and the people who are building it, which for the most part are still the big tech titans that rule today's technology, right? So like on the one hand, we're sort of saying we'd be free from those structures, but the people who are developing it now are the people who are actually in power. So I think there's a big gap there in terms of what that vision it looks like and how to try and build it.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is that for any of us that have sort of been schooled in UX and user-centered design theory, where it's drilled into us to think about the user. But in a lot of these debates, it seems to be much more about picking a mark where the technology goes and then trying to retrofit a use for the technology. And I reckon if these guys were starting out, they wouldn't get past first base.
Yeah, exactly. And the mantras of big tech are starting to come undone as well. Like, so move fast and break things used to be like a really popular saying that Facebook had popularized.
Like break democracy, yeah.
Exactly. And now we're realizing actually there's probably merit in moving slowly and fixing things. So I think the Web3 idea is just a symptom of that kind of mindset, and in steroids really. And some of the critics of Web3, let's take Meta for example, how they're rebranded from Facebook to Meta. Some of the critics sort of say that they just did that because they're furiously trying to get away from this current version of social media that they've essentially broken, and so they're trying to rebrand it to something else and hopefully have a clean slate. So again, you have to kind of look at what those underlying motivations are and who is actually building these new technologies.
So just stretching out the user-centered design, the other thing that you do is you're taught to build personas. And what we've got in your book is a bunch of pretty dysfunctional personas for whom poor design has rendered them a victim. I'm interested, and I know you have policy prescriptions, but can we change these personas to give them a happier story? Or are we locked into these, the pest, the troll, the narcissist, the fighter? Like, how do we shift this around?
Yeah, and I recognize that the personas seem overly pessimistic, but I think the point is that we shouldn't ignore the harms, and that most user personas actually build for a positive state. And when you're going through a software design process, it's like you have Dan, who's the heavy news consumer, and Carla, who might enjoy entertainment, and Peter, who's really into politics. So those use cases are often positive, but the reason why I called out the negative side of it is just to make sure we don't ignore it. And when we're thinking about building for these users, is like, who are those users? Are we including enough of the right people? Are we making sure that nobody's left behind? And so user experience and human-centered design is like a nice general philosophy, but are we including all the humans as part of that? And clearly at the moment we're not, because these kind of outliers and these dysfunctions are surfacing.
So Dan, I guess you and I could have both at times been accused of being naive futurists. What's the positive flip and the reframe? How do we become people that want to embrace a future but do it not naively?
Geez, Peter, that's a big question. I'm not sure if I've got the answer to it, but I mean, I think it probably comes back to what Jordan has touched on. I mean, I think a lot of the problem with where this tech has started is not from ill intentions at the beginning. It's just from unintended consequences from these platforms that have emerged as they've gained traction. I mean, startups are very hard, right? They're very hard to do. I've got some experience with this, not great experience either. They haven't necessarily gone very well, but getting them off the ground is often, you know, your audience's safety is often a lesser consideration as you're trying to just make your business
Then your
survive.
investors' well-being, yes.
That's right. And then, you know, you gain traction, but unfortunately that sets the culture of a lot of these organizations then. It's because they then start having traction and start becoming popular, and what should have been front of mind at the beginning is not. I mean, I think the lesson that we need to take, and perhaps where we can improve the future, is just we have to be, there's been this sort of utopian version or vision of what tech can do for society as it goes. And look, technology has done amazing things for society over the last sort of 2 decades or so in particular. But the downsides are also starting to become very, very obvious. And so I think that just needs to be something which is built into the start of companies and the culture of these companies from the very, very beginning. But Jordan, I don't know, what do you think? How can we have a more optimistic take on things? How can the future be better than where we are now?
Yeah, well, one of the key projects that Centre for Responsible Technology has been thinking about for a while is, you know, the Public Square project, and I think, you know, it's called slightly different now, but the idea that we build alternative platforms. I think I challenged the notion that the way the internet is set up now, and particularly some of the bigger digital platforms, are the only way we can do it. And so if we invest in alternative platforms that, you know, don't necessarily have a profit incentive or don't necessarily have a design where it's meant to, you know, where it only cares about, you know, engagement and keeping people in their platforms for as long as possible, then we can maybe start to experience an online environment that is a little bit healthier. And it started off that way in the early days of, you know, Web 1.1 and Web 2.0, but what we've seen is now there's only a small handful of companies that dominates most of our online experience. So if we can actually get to that plurality of digital platforms again, we might start to recover what the original intent of the internet was, which is this, you know, kind of very diverse, open experience.
So it sounds like a bigger role for government then, Jordan. Sorry, last question. A bigger role for government.
Well, I was actually going to throw the government thing to Carla and then round it back, because I do think there is this tension between the individual, the corporations, and the government. So Carla, having worked in a lot of policy, where does government play?
I think where it's getting to, and I think to some extent this is very much where the Centre for Responsible Technology has gone, and the Public Square debate, is that we almost need to have a reframe of the notion, because we've seen very much government around cyber rather than in cyber. And I think we need to start having a bit more of a conversation about what is the political philosophy of the internet, what is the kind of structures within the internet, whether they're government or non-government structures, that are going to stabilize and create some of those mechanisms around the balance of power between individuals and between concentrated power, so that we can actually start to look at driving the sorts of accountability mechanisms which lead to better platform design. I think part of that is really about sort of the government in the real world, but I think part of it is also how do we create those structures online?
That's totally right. I've been musing over this around the data hacks while talking about my vasectomy as well. But the idea of oversharing, I know, but then I was the one that was hacked. In terms of personal identity, I think there is now an acceptance that our ID and our intimate details should not be held in 100 different companies. The question is whether we trust government to build a secure wallet for our identity, whether we go down the Berners-Lee 3.0 path and try to set up our own pod and control it, or else we imagine a third space that operates in our interest. And I suspect we haven't even got to the landing point on all that. But Jordan, they are the three bits. And I often feel that if it's just individual or just government, and there is not this broader sense of a civility, civic structures, the same way industry super funds look after our finances, then we're not going to find the answer, because we don't want the state to have total control, but we can't do it all ourselves.
Completely. And I think it is trying to find that balance between all the different stakeholders and making sure that everybody's needs are represented is probably where we need to get to. And at the moment, it is just a little bit more imbalanced in that, I guess only a handful of corporate interests are defining our current experience. So we need to rebalance it again for the more civic side. And obviously now we're seeing a lot of regulation, so government's starting to get involved again. So maybe we're starting to see that rebalancing happening now.
I think the other interesting bit, and maybe this is around last thought for everyone, is that innovation that is done on the venture capital model is going to lead to certain outcomes. So how do you create an environment of civic innovation, which is done with good design principles, talking to the best in the personas that you've built out there? Dan? Solve the internet for us in 30 seconds.
Sure. That's an easy task. Look, I think it's two things. I think the big problem that we've seen with the Web 2.0 companies is that they've gotten too big and have too much influence. And therefore, I think there's a perhaps dry but important role for competition policy just to make it easier for alternatives to emerge that perhaps put people's safety at the heart of things. Basically, that's one part of it. The other part of it, I think there needs to be a greater focus on privacy going forward. I think that one of the problems we see with a lot of these companies, a lot of the harms that come from these companies, is that people's privacy is compromised, which led to you talking about your vasectomy in the Sydney Morning Herald this week, Peter, and I thank you for that. But
always happy to share.
But the point is, this is the point, right? Like the point that you were making clearly is, all of this very personal information is now out there on the internet because we don't have sufficient privacy regulation. I think it's not going to solve the internet clearly, but if we can improve the competition between these big companies and have much more smaller companies that have less influence, and we can put people's privacy at the heart of everything we do going forward, I think we'll go some way towards solving the problems. But interested to hear what the others think.
No, look, I'm a bit of a structuralist. So I think, to some extent, there's some really good points there around competition policy and the fact that until you change the underlying economy of how the internet works in terms of the attention economy and rebalance that, I think we've got some serious issues in terms of the way in which it's naturally going to drive in one direction. And I think how we think about that and how we also create a much more nuanced and balanced idea of what the internet could be that we all share in.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone that joined us for Burning Platforms. Jordan, congratulations again. If people want a special discount price of Disconnect through our website, www.centreforresponsible.technology.org.au/publications. Thanks, guys. And Mazel Tov, Jordan.
Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. It was recorded on October 14. If you'd like to attend one of these discussions in real life, you can register at centreforresponsible.technology.org.au. Burning Platforms was produced on Gadigal land by Jennifer Macy. Talk again in a fortnight.